Welcome to the history of oil. In this class, we are going to examine the emergence of the modern energy economy and the myriad ways in which oil and all of its products have formed the foundation of modern civilization. The root of that story is a seemingly unending succession of foundational discoveries in science and engineering, as we discovered petroleum and all of its different properties and the incredible potential it had for changing our lives. But I want to encourage you to think about technology as something more than scientific discovery. For scientific discoveries have to be translated into applications in our everyday society. And so technology is about a broader story. We're going to talk a great deal in this class about business and economics, about the formation of markets and the organization of capital, and also the structure of American corporations. We're going to think also about politics and geopolitics and the story of how both American and other governments had to decide how to regulate the various aspects of oil production and consumption, and also entered into competition with each other as international states competed for oil resources. Another theme is culture and the way that the various products that we've derived from oil have transformed our lifestyles and our life chances, and in the process changed our very values as a society. Our use of oil has not only profoundly impacted ourselves and our society, it's also, of course, dramatically impacted the natural environment and the world that we live in. So we're also going to think about climate change and the effect of resource depletion and living in a world of resource scarcity. From each of these perspectives, or within each of these themes, I'm going to encourage you to think about the dilemmas and the paradoxes that oil presented to each generation as they encountered its amazing potential both to transform our lives and empower us, enable us to overcome some of the most fundamental challenges to survival that man has faced really since the dawn of civilization, but at the same time, the ways in which oil creates dependencies and exploitative relationships between people and societies and nations. It's this duality of oil which is so emblematic of man's encounter with technology more broadly, and is encapsulated in that famous question of Henry David Thoreau's, do we ride the train or does the train ride us? And it's that spirit of paradox and dilemma that I'm going to ask you to take with you through the materials for this class. Our textbook for this class, Daniel Jurgens' The Prize, is going to pick up the story in the middle of the 19th century and in the middle of the Industrial Revolution and the search for an artificial source of light. Oil, of course, has a much, much longer history than that. The major geological oil deposits that we have exploited over the last, say, 150, 175 years were primarily formed around 300 to 350 million years ago. And of course, humans have been using and applying oil in a variety of ways for thousands and thousands of years. The purpose of this first introductory video then is to just briefly summarize, say, those first 300 million years of oil's history to bring us to the doorstep of Jurgens' text. For the purposes of this class and the chapters that I have assigned you to read out of Jurgen and the assignment structure based on that reading, we're going to divide this story into three broad phases. In the first period, it really is a story about American development and the history of the United States. The United States is going to be, as you will see, at least a technological generation ahead of even the most advanced industrial European countries like Great Britain and France. And so in this first phase, really at least up to World War I, we're going to be looking primarily in American history at the development of oil as a product for both lighting and lubrication, and in particular, the development of American companies, Standard Oil and its derivatives, and the development of American corporate law, which enabled this corporation to concentrate capital on a scale virtually unseen before in Western history. As we get closer to the world wars, then we'll want to think more about the international context, and that will take us into understanding the structure of 19th century European empires and the way in which the major international locations for oil were being ruled under imperial structures. The distribution of different countries' claims upon the major oil deposits in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific then were in many ways dictated by the geopolitics of both the First and the Second World Wars. Among its many dramatic consequences, World War II brought about the final demise of the 19th century European imperial system and led to a redivision of geopolitics and a rivalry between the Soviet Union, China, and its communist allies, what we refer to as the East, and the United States and Western Europe, and its what we think of as democratic capitalist allies, or the West. The United States was the undisputed leader and hegemonic power of the Free West Alliance. And that led American companies then to take the lead in the development of oil resources spread throughout the world in those alliance states. During the 25 years that followed World War II, the Free West was awash in oil. There was a glut of oil in the world market, or at least the free world market. Oil was plentiful and cheap, and there was a myriad of new products that were developed, all based on intensive energy consumption. It was a period in which the amount of oil and carbon energy in the world seemed literally inexhaustible. The final phase of Jürgen's story is how the floor fell out from beneath that sense of empowerment and freedom and the inexhaustibility of oil. Starting in really the late 60s, but picking up steam in the early 1970s, the oil-producing countries, primarily organized through the organization known as OPEC, started to demand different financial arrangements and different permission structures for Western countries to come in and produce oil within their nations. The major event in this decade is a series of oil embargoes in which the oil-producing countries attempted to shut off the Western powers from access to their oil, and a series of sort of escalating military interventions by the Western powers in those states trying to secure oil resources for their economies. This culminates in Jürgen's book with the first Persian Gulf War in 1991. Now, Jürgen's text was published in 1992, so he could not have seen beyond it, though he has written an epilogue in subsequent editions, particularly the 2003 edition. The major phase that happens after sort of what we think of as the producers of revolt and the oil wars of the 70s and 80s is, of course, the collapse of communism in the 1990s and the opening up of China and Russia and the former Soviet states to the global economy. That story Jürgen tells in a follow-up book, which I highly recommend if you like the if you like the prize, a book called The Quest. For this class, we're going to take the story up to about 1990, the collapse of communism in the first Gulf War, and I'll have an opportunity then just to summarize some of the major features of the current situation, the sort of the current phase that we're living in today. So let's turn then, just by way of getting us up to speed and thinking in Jürgen's, kind of in the framework of Jürgen's analysis, and spend just a couple minutes talking about some basic earth science, deep geologic time, and the way pre-industrial peoples thought about and used oil in their everyday lives. Hopefully you are familiar with the terms fossil fuels or carbon energy and have some sense of what they refer to. You may have heard someone refer when they were filling their gas tank in their car to putting dinosaur bones in their tank. That captures the spirit of the thing, though it's not quite accurate. Certainly the total biomass of all the dinosaurs combined was a fraction of the plant biomass that was produced even during the dinosaurs era, let alone the eons of plant growth that preceded the dinosaurs in the world, but it captures the spirit of the thing. Of course, when we're talking about fossil fuels, petroleum, coal, and the other terms that we use to refer to it, we're thinking about the accumulated biomass of all living organisms, that is, all carbon-based life. By far the most prevalent form of that carbon-based life is plants and all their different varieties. That this biomass lives and grows and develops and eventually dies and withers and becomes compacted as succeeding generations of plants and animals grow on top of it. That compacted biomass then under tremendous pressure becomes over time compacted into and essentially dried out and squeezed out, all the fluids squeezed out of it, and eventually becomes coal. Now, you may have heard of geology referred to as the study of pressure over time. And that's a good way of thinking about the geologic kind of innovations and the development of geology as a science that we're going to be talking about this semester. When we're talking about pressure, we're thinking about absolutely astronomical quantities of pressure over almost inconceivable periods of time. Again, hopefully you come to the class with some sense of the periodization of Earth's geologic history. We think that the planet is about 4 billion years old or so, and we're particularly interested about 500 million years ago. It's referred to as the Cambrian explosion. There are single-celled and multi-celled life forms that precede it, but around 500 million years ago, there is an explosion in life forms on Earth. The archaeological record shows, and in particular the period around 300 to 350 million years ago, referred to as the Carboniferous period, is a period of intense plant growth. And most of the petroleum and coal resources and deposits that we are searching for when we're looking to extract oil date from that period, from the Carboniferous period. Geology as a field then is driven by this need to map the subterranean stratum of the Earth's crust, if you will, and to determine its mineral composition and to understand the dynamics between those different subterranean stratum. That would be a comparatively simple or easy project to engage in if it weren't for tectonic dynamics that upend and disrupt the different neat layers of the Earth's crust, and of course terrestrial activity in terms of erosion and water runoff and the rising and falling of sea levels that interrupt and change these and give them complicated geologic structures. Then geologists, as scientists, then look for their record of evidence, which they study, in this mapping of the subterranean structures. One of the great things about studying geology and taking geology classes is that you can in many places, walk outside and you can see the evidence that you are trying to hypothesize and understand its internal structure. When you look at, if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon or similar places, those variations in the colors are, of course, different mineral compositions of those different layers of Earth. In many cases, they create quite beautiful patterns, as in on the picture on the left. But of course, when we are searching for oil deposits and oil resources, we're interested in those particular strata that have high concentrations of carbon in them, or coals you see in the lower right. So the search for oil resources is the attempt to understand geology's mapping of subterranean structures and identify those layers that are rich in the mineral resource that you're trying to extract. Now, coal is fairly ubiquitous around the world. That is, say, every major kind of ecosystem, from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Amazonian rainforests, have the potential to have coal reserves buried deep beneath them. When we are searching for the liquid form of lignite, that is to say oil or petroleum, we are looking for very specific kinds of geologic structure, because of course coal becomes coal because it has had all of the fluids and gases squeezed out of it. When we're looking for the fluid form, then we're looking for a source of lignite that hasn't really had the opportunity to become fully dried out coal or shale yet. And the figure that you see on your screen shows the kind of classic example of an oil pool or pocket. At the bottom of the figure is the source rock, the lignite. But what keeps the oil and water and gas from escaping is that impermeable rock seal. And you want to think about this figure as kind of like a pimple on your skin, right? It's here under pressure. It's existing under pressure. So if you stick a straw through that impermeable rock layer, the seal layer, it's going to come out under force. A little bit like an aerosol can, right? Or a can of whip topping, Cool Whip or whatnot. You shake the can, you open the nozzle, and the gas pressure in there forces out the fluid that's in there. Now, it is comparatively rare, of course, to find pristine oil pools or pockets, completely self-contained, just sitting there as a little bubble in the land. What's far more common is to find pools and pockets within the complex geological structures that we were looking at before. So the image on the upper right here shows an oil pool with an impermeable seal layer over the top, but then the oil is capable of seeping on the underside of that seal layer, if you will, until it finds a way out to the surface. So oil seeps are very common, and they're a kind of clue to there must be a pool around here somewhere, but of course then it takes complex geology to try to figure out where the location of that pool is in reference to the seep. The image in the lower left has a different kind of example. Rather than an impermeable seal layer trapping the oil and the gas and the water all together, you have the image refers to as confining layers, which instead act as a kind of screen and sort out the water from the oil from the gas. And then at the base of that, of course, is the coal. So the search for oil is a very complicated endeavor rooted in geology. Geology gives us the kind of blueprint map, but then it really is a matter of hunting and drilling dozens or hundreds of holes until you find the location of whatever you can see, the kind of the source material of whatever you can see on the surface. So long before the development of modern geology and the engineering sciences that have allowed us to extract oil from its deepest subterranean recesses, humans were aware of oil and its different properties in the form in which it appeared on the terrestrial surface. geologic sites in which oil appeared in its kind of gooey, semi-fluid tar or pitch state were relatively rare, but they were also then renowned and very well known in the ancient world. Far more common is in its rock state as coal, what the Romans would have thought of as bitumen or referred to as bitumen. And even more common would be sort of floodplains, either of rivers or of seas and lakes that have a hard geologic substructure. And the effect of the kind of operating as a floodplain is that the water erosion works out the soft veins of minerals and, if you will, sort of opens up those fissures that allows petroleum to come to the surface. So sort of oily, swampy areas would have been very common and well understood in the ancient world. From the earliest periods of civilization, then, humans were aware of oil and had a variety of uses for it. Probably the best known property of oil in its kind of semi-fluid, tarry, sticky state is its waterproofing and buoyancy qualities. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see there an Egyptian hieroglyph of some workmen creating a reed boat or canoe. If when they finish that raft, they turn it over and pour some warm tar over the bottom of it and spread it around. When that tar cools, that reed boat will become amazingly more buoyant and be able to carry much more weight, right? Another early form of watercraft, of course, is simply made by creating a wooden hoop out of a stick or branch and then spreading a animal hide across it and stitching it around the edges. It's a basic animal hide raft. If you take that animal hide and again you pour some hot tar over the bottom of it, it'll become amazingly more buoyant and be able to carry more weight. As humans began to develop more complicated watercraft like ships and plank shipping, we're going to use tar and pitch to coat the wooden planks when we build the boats, and we're going to put on repeated applications of tar on the hull in early boats to maintain its waterproofing and buoyancy qualities. Of course, that's horrible for the sort of dynamics of the boat moving through the water, but it makes the simple wood forms of early watercraft last much longer. And again, one of its major qualities is it allows the craft to carry more weight before it sinks into the water. There's a variety of medicinal applications for this. What you see in the images in the upper right is a tooth molar made out of asphalt. That is to say, we're going to drill out or yank your tooth out, and in that gaping hole in your jaw, we're going to pour in some hot tar and let it cool. Doesn't sound too pleasant, especially without modern Novocaine, but you can imagine how it will cauterize the wound, and that's really the effect of it. So hot tar is far too expensive and important a commodity to use it in everyday medicine, but if you did have a cut wound and you put some hot tar on it, it would hurt very bad, but you can imagine how it would help to seal and cauterize the cut, and then could sort of be peeled off after and leave very little residue against the skin. You'd have a hell of a burn there, but you would stop the bleeding. The Romans, of course, are famous for their road building, and you see in the bottom right there a kind of cross section of a Roman road. One of the great things about bitumen is it breaks up very easily, and you can make it into a hard kind of gravelly powder for the substructure. But especially those big stones on top, if you take hot tar and you pour it over the top of that, just like we do with modern asphalt roads, it's going to kind of work its way into all those cracks and crevices, seal them tight, keep dirt from coming out and working the stones loose, and of course help water to wash off the top and not get in and cause erosions and make roads last a lot longer. Now again, tar in its kind of liquid state is a very expensive commodity in the ancient world. It's hard to get your hands on that, so it would only be in sort of urban areas, high traffic areas where people were able to invest a considerable amount in the road building to actually cover them. But the Romans did it quite commonly. You may have heard stories if you've seen the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe. I think that's still a favorite. You will see in that opening scene the Romans using their trebuchets to launch those fireballs against the Germans hiding in the woods. So the ancient Romans and even earlier peoples were well aware that you could get that hot, gooey tar set on fire, and you could throw it at people you don't like and set them on fire. In fact, if you're aware of the latter Eastern Roman Empire that became the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine Empire was the hegemonic military power in the Near East for several hundred years, and one of their kind of secret weapons was called Greek fire, and they were able to launch, if you will, kind of just flaming blobs of tar at their enemy ships. And it's not that different than our modern napalm, right? And the thing about that blob tar is it'll stick to stuff, especially the wooden hulls of their enemies' ships. So not only is it on fire, but it sticks to whatever you shoot it at, and it'll attach to it and set that thing on fire as well. And that was known as Greek fire, and that was, if you will, sort of the nuclear arsenal of the near ancient world for several hundred years, that the Byzantines knew the secret to making Greek fire. Less common, but also very important to keep in mind, is that how special were the places where petroleum came to the terrestrial surface. The most famous and renowned of these in the ancient world is a place called Baku, which is on the western shore of the Caspian Sea. We'll have a chance to talk much more about Baku later in the class. But Baku is a mountainous region in the modern nation of Azerbaijan, in which oil seeps to the surface. It has since the ancient world, and it will spontaneously combust and light on fire. And so there are ridges in the mountains that have flames bursting out of them. If you're at all familiar with Persian culture and the kind of pre-Islamic tradition of the Persian peoples, is a religious faith called Zoroastrianism. And one of the features of Zoroastrianism is that they worship the fire god. Well, these mountains in Baku are essentially the northern region of ancient Persia. So you have to imagine sort of Stone Age and Bronze Age civilizations, their discovery of these areas seem mystical and otherworldly, right? The crust of the earth is ripping apart, and if you will, sort of demons from the netherworld are roaring out to the surface to talk to them. In the lower left-hand image in the square of images labeled religion, that is in fact a very ancient temple called the Temple of the Eternal Flame in Azerbaijan, just outside of Baku, that has been a place of worship for thousands and thousands of years. So petroleum, oil, tar, pitch were very well known to pre-industrial peoples. Now, Jurgen is going to begin his story in the middle of the 19th century, in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and he's going to give us just a couple of paragraphs, a short subsection, a kind of context of the state of technology in the 1850s and why there is such an urgent need for a product with the properties such as oil. Jurgen is going to emphasize two particular things: the need for a lubricant and the need for a source of artificial lighting. So let's wrap up this introductory video by looking at just a few specific examples of what Jurgen briefly summarizes to give you a more concrete sense of oil's utility, kind of amazing property values in the period in which it was discovered. Hopefully you come to the class with some sense of the meaning of that term, industrial revolution. You should be thinking about inventions that really date from the last third or so, the last quarter of the 18th century or the 1700s, that in essence mechanized production, or were the kind of root source of our modern factory system. If you do have some familiarity with that term, then you may associate textile mills, and especially British textile mills, as the driving force of the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. The great technological breakthrough with textiles was the automation of the old spinning jenny, where you would sit and card wool into yarn, and then the loom, which would then weave, of course, multiple strands of yarn into cloth. And the automation and integration of those two processes, really the earliest inventions in the 1750s and the 1760s, and something like the image you see at the bottom of the screen, more typical of the 1820s and the 1830s. Now, the mill as a kind of generic technology is a very ancient one. That is to say, a mill may be applied to a variety of different uses. You may also be commonly familiar with a flour mill, which is one of the most common applications of the mill. So a mill really refers to a kind of concentration of power generation, right? The turning of a central axle and then the application of any number of tools to that turning axle, which is really quite a challenging engineering feat for pre-industrial peoples. The image that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, the upper left of the screen, is itself a 16th century Northern European example of a flour mill, but its basic construction would have been well within the range of, say, the ancient Romans or even the ancient Greeks. The essential element, you see the sort of power element in this design, is that giant spinning water wheel. If you notice the human figures in the interior of that mill, you can see that that water wheel in scale has to be at least 15 to 20 feet in diameter. And the key thing to notice is this entire apparatus is all wood construction. So that water wheel is just rough-hewn timbers, 15 to 20 feet in diameter. Can we say at least 4 feet across the width of the wheel, and turning on a solid wood axis. That wood axis, you'll notice in the lower left-hand part of that image, is turning inside of a stone or brick pivot point. We have to imagine that that wheel alone must weigh, easily 1,000 pounds, probably much more, and you add to it the axle, right? So you have to imagine the amount of mass, how much momentum is being generated when that water wheel turns with the the dugout canal there. Notice then how the transaxle is attached with all wooden gears, right? So you can work out gear ratios. You can turn that vertical axis much more quickly than the horizontal axis is turning with the different gear ratios, but you're still building those gears out of wooden teeth. So if you imagine the tremendous amount of force that is being generated with these with this joint, and then realize that there is no lubrication for those turning points. Any of you who are engineers who have taken hydraulics classes and whatnot will realize that this is a design that's going to be constantly breaking down. You're going to be constantly having to replace the wooden teeth. You're just turning a tremendous amount of mass and force. And if you don't have a water source to turn a water wheel, you can sort of exit that item, run that vertical axis all the way down to, say, a basement, right? You can elevate the thing, attach poles to that, and then attach oxen or horses or donkeys or mules or whatnot, make those animals walk in a circle, and that can turn a vertical axis, and then you can have horizontal kind of transaxis with gears running the other way. That is a pre-industrial mill. And again, in this particular application, it's for flour, but you could attach any number of tools, say a lathe and other items like that, to that vertical axis and power tools. If you look at the image on the upper right, that is an example of a kind of mid-industrial revolution flour mill. That's, in fact, the flour mill design of a guy named Oliver Evans. It's quite renowned. This is one of the earliest patents issued by the U.S. Patent Office in, I believe it's 1795. It's in the mid-1790s. And this design became broadly distributed, at least in the mid-Atlantic states, all through the first half of the 19th century. There would have been Evans-designed flour mills from western Massachusetts all the way down to Maryland and even northern Virginia. The key thing to notice about that blueprint in the upper right-hand corner are all the metal parts, and there are two key ones to take particular attention to. There are these series of vertical chains or linkages, so these horizontal bars are being turned with essentially a pulley system with iron chains. And the second metal piece to notice about that are all these horizontal screws. If you notice the scale of the design, this entire apparatus here is on the scale of about 60 feet across. If we guess at the scale interior, those screws have got to be 6 or 8 inches in diameter. So you have to imagine the tremendous weight. This is essentially raw iron, and it's sort of state-of-the-art technology because these screws, giant screws, are going to turn, and that's what's going to pull the grain through the successive stages of grinding, right? The flour grain or whatever you're pouring in there, the wheat, the barley, whatever you're dumping in this thing. And instead of having it to be moved by hand or by buckets, the screws are just going to move it around to the various levels of the refining process. So the combination, the mechanization of these two tasks makes this state-of-the-art technology at the end of the 18th century. But again, think of the total mass involved here. Think of how much these screws must have weighed, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, let's say sections of 8 or 10 feet apiece that have to be hooked together to add up to as much as 40 feet or 50 feet long. These are easily weigh hundreds upon hundreds of pounds. They are turning, in this case, on these kind of sprocket pulley apparatuses, but nevertheless with no lubrication. You have to imagine the amount of heat and friction and how much wear there is on these items that are essentially in, soft iron for the most part. And the problem that the manufacturers face then because they can't cool and lubricate all these items. Coming back again to the image in the bottom of the screen, this is a textile mill typical of the 1820s or the 1830s. You see how much heavier the iron design of the mills are, the looms here are, much heavier, and the geared teeth that are interacting with each other, which you don't see in the Evans design. So in many ways, you can see that this is 10, 20, 30 years further along in our ability to mold and design and manufacture metal. These are much heavier machines with more complicated interactions than you see even in the Evans design. But notice the power source here. If you look to the ceiling, it's these series of lateral poles with these barrels built around them, and then these are leather straps that are run down to in tension. You assume those lateral poles are being sort of pulled down and trying to spring back into shape, and that keeps tension on these belts that are turning these giant wrought iron wheels. How do you lubricate that? How much heat must that generate? And how quickly would those leather belts break down if you didn't lubricate them? Well, in fact, what factory owners do in this period is they hire people to take giant handfuls of essentially animal lard, right? Cow fat and pig fat, and wipe their hands along the belts as they're moving to keep those leather belts soft and supple and in tension. Again, if you think about the interaction of this heavy iron machinery, and there's no system of oil lubrication in any of this stuff. This is essentially soft metal. It's very heavy, and it's moving in tension with the other parts. These parts are going to be constantly wearing down, constantly breaking and jamming up, and having to be replaced. So when Jurgen talks about the need for a lubrication, he's talking about exactly this moment where we cannot advance significantly further in our sort of machinery design if we can't solve the problem of the heat and the friction created by having metal gears intermeshed with each other. Another area in which the Industrial Revolution had sort of hit a wall in its technological development because of the lack of a product or material with the properties of oil is in the area of hydraulics. Again, if you have had some encounter with the Industrial Revolution in previous classes, you may be familiar or associate the early steam engines with this period. More likely, you're familiar with James Watt and Robert Fulton's steamboat patents, and that's in the early, the 1800s, essentially. The steam engine really is a British invention, and you see the image in the upper right-hand corner of Bolton and Watts from 1788, two Brits who invented this apparatus. We have, of course, the boiler, starting from the left-hand side with the smokestack. Notice that they're burning coal, so they are aware of the, sort of the power unleashed by lighting coal on fire. We're going to boil water in that central boiler. The pipe system then sends the hot water into the base of the piston, right? The expanding steam power of the water lifts the plunger. That plunger in turn moves that. Notice it's still a wooden arm, right? Attached to the giant wrought iron wheel on the right-hand side of the image. As the plunger gets to the top, those cooling gases are going to be allowed to escape through that top vent. You close the lower valve, so you shut off the hot steam that's being allowed inside. Once that piston is empty, of course, then the weight of that arm will allow the piston to fall back down to the floor. Open up the bottom valve, let in more hot steam, the plunger rises again. You do that over and over again, and you get that huge iron wheel spinning pretty fast, and you have generated an enormous amount of energy. The earliest sort of locomotive applications for the steam engine are in the 1790s, and they're mostly confined to sort of coal mines and other mines to bring up heavy material along railroad tracks built down into the mine shafts. Now again, for those of you who are engineers who have taken hydraulics classes or had to learn hydraulics for the classes that you've taken, you will immediately understand that the kind of the heart of this mechanism is using water as a hydraulic fluid. And you will immediately understand that of all the fluids you could possibly pick to be a hydraulic fluid, water has to be among the worst. First, because water is comparatively squishy or condensable compared to petroleum-based hydraulic fluids. And of course, more obviously, the great kind of cutting-edge technology of this device is the incredibly precise machining of the metal in that piston cylinder, all right, and the piston, how close the tolerances are to be able to trap that gas in place. When you use water as your hydraulic fluid, all of that, and especially when you're using pretty primitive soft iron to make these things, that water is going to be constantly oxidizing the surface of that metal, that is rusting it out. And so you're going to have endless problems maintaining your seals. You're going to be constantly leaking steam out of every seal point, and we don't have any kind of rubber products, or the most crude rubber products. Far more common is to use cork, and you would soak cork in any number of fluids to keep it kind of supple. But you can imagine using water as the hydraulic fluid in your system and using soft iron as the metal. You're just going to be endlessly pitting the interiors and the kind of tolerances at every interface. Nevertheless, this is cutting-edge technology for the end of the 18th, start of the 19th century, and the power unleashed by the early locomotives to be able to haul just absolutely fantastic quantities of weight of commodities over long distances with comparatively little energy consumption is going to revolutionize transportation in the 19th century. But again, one of the major limiting factors here why we can't build bigger, faster, more responsive steam engines is because we have not yet discovered petroleum and its wonderful properties as a hydraulic fluid. Finally then, and probably most obviously, was the urgent need to find a source of artificial light. Really, from the dawn of civilization, as old as man is, we have been living in terror of the dark. It's one of the hardest things for modern 21st century people to understand is just how dark the world is before we invented kerosene and then, of course, subsequently the electric light bulb. From the time we gathered together all around the common campfire to all stay warm, we have, once the sun goes down, lived in fear and terror of the things that are prowling around just beyond what we can see. Now, by the middle of the 19th century or the early 19th century, the most common form of artificial light for most people, that is for average farmers and whatnot, working people, would be candles. And so I've offered you here just a couple of images to give you a sense of just how little light candles emit. And I would offer you the experiment: go home tonight, shut the doors after the sun goes down, pull your blinds down or whatever, and just light one candle on your desk, and then see what kind of work you're able to accomplish. Can you read a book in a single candlelight? Could you do some kind of, knitting or sewing or cooking or anything like that? How many candles would you have to light before you could actually see what you're doing effectively? If you notice the image on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a tradesman working after dark. Maybe it's a potter, I'm not sure. But what does he have? 5 candles lit just so he can concentrate on that one tiny spot. So for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, humans have been trying to find a way to light up the dark. By the middle of the 19th century, it's an urgent problem, not simply for kind of home life and cooking and studying and whatnot, but by the middle of the 19th century, we've invested an enormous amount of money in building these new mills, these new steam engines, these other places of work and manufactory, and there's no particular reason that they should have to shut down when the sun goes down, except for the fact that nobody can see each other and we're going to get our arms cut off in the loom and whatnot. That is, you can't light enough candles to effectively illuminate a place like a textile mill, right? And so if we could come up with a powerful and illuminant source of artificial light that was cheap and effective and could be mass produced, the entire industrial revolution could expand beyond, if you will, dusk or sundown. And that's the urgency and the kind of primary explanation. This is really a half a century before we're going to invent the automobile, and gasoline is going to be the big consumer of petroleum. For a half a century before that, those inventions, it was the economic power of those textile mills to become vastly more productive if we could find a solution to the problem of the dark. And that's really the place where Jurgen is going to pick up his text. We're going to find ourselves in the mountains of western Pennsylvania with a whole cast of characters trying to create the Seneca Oil Company. So let's wrap up this introductory video here and turn in the next video to the beginning of Jurgen's text.